I'd like to begin by just making a quick point before I start any rebuttal regarding the last speaker. It is worth remembering that in the long run, everyone will die. Everyone is dead. But first, I'd like to say hello. We haven't really addressed the interesting introduction we received. I would, just as our introducer predicted, like to vociferously protest that I would rather eat hakal, if you've ever encountered that from Iceland, every single day for the rest of my life and vote Tory. And I would please suggest for anyone in the room, including Dara O'Reilly, nice to see you, if you could please consider if you are eligible to vote on the 12th of December, choose wisely, and for God's sake, stand up and be counted. But to move on to rebuttal, the first proposition made a good case. How can we reject the economic benefit of migration? The answer is simple, because of the instability. I will move on to this into my substantive. I'm just introducing where the rebuttal will be. Secondly, they made the point that hospital infrastructure will magically cope from increased GDP from migrants. This ignores the simple fact that there will be a long delay between the arrival of migrants and the time at which they start generating GDP through tax. And even the most dynamic systems are not capable of coping with that. This is catastrophically dangerous as it's advocating for a free market of states. And I'll move on to that point very much. So, to move into the substantive points immediately, I'm going to be talking mostly about nation states. The fundamental effects of this motion are existentially threatening to nation states. States cannot plan or function normally as they do today under the parameters of this motion. Firstly, states will suddenly find themselves unable to carry out the necessary functions they must achieve successfully by the basic parameters of what we expect from a state: security, healthcare, welfare. So let's move on to the two reasons: emigration and immigration. Emigration. In the countries where migrants depart, the civil service and all other social services could be so catastrophically undermined that social support networks and the government collapse completely, destroying the state's functionality to provide humanitarian care and basic protection. At some point, a state should have the right to prevent someone leaving their country if it is existential to the state's survival. This will affect most acutely the states that are most economically unviable at present, because they are the primary source of migration in the world today, excluding conflict. So this will exacerbate the already existing global inequalities. So secondly, immigration. The similar effects derive from that, but the sudden overload is the trigger. The supply networks of a state cannot dynamically cope fast enough with an influx of migration. The effect on the short term would be potentially catastrophic, and while we would concede that better than an emigrating nation, the state could recover in the long term, the short-term effect must also be considered. So, to move on to the idea more broadly of unstable conditions and the idea of a free market of states. The idea that a migrant or any citizen on earth who is entitled to be a migrant under this policy can move to whatever state they see are best, the most attractive. That is, fundamentally, a free market of states where you vote with your feet. This threatens democracy, as the instability of electoral locations within nation-state boundaries renders most democratic systems today unworkable. To prove this is a serious risk, I'd like to diverge, perhaps dangerously, into alt-right and NRX thinkers like Nick Land, who do actively advocate for a global, only to oppose them, I should point out, who do actively advocate for a global migration market system between city-states or nation-states where people vote with their feet, and instead of democracy, this will be the means by which ideal government is achieved. Democracy is destroyed. Nick Land did fail to consider the problems of the tyranny of the majority that would emerge, the risk of a money equals influence system where those who are economically deprived, as are our primary concern as the source of migration in this debate, are most at risk and we must be considering most, and you'll end up with states that have no concern for social welfare. So to move further, second, you fundamentally prevent governments from establishing proper social care provision, safety, stability, strong and stable, or reliable or fair social redistribution or justice. If the population repeatedly changes significantly in unpredictable ways due to open borders and a lack of checked regulation, the government loses its fundamental ability to plan long term. How can a government positively implement social change or engineering for the better if a reliable structure of demographic makeup cannot be maintained? This is not just economically, this regards language, culture, integration, ability to cooperate with co-workers. Any major change, or more importantly I should say, how can the government tackle hate crime if it is incapable of measuring who is actually within its borders and the issues that are occurring? Third, any major change, as any economist will tell you, equals instability. This is the recurrent theme. It's worth briefly considering that the well-documented flows of instability of 2008 and the Arab Spring demonstrate that already instability is capable of crossing borders. Think how much worse it will get if we allow migrants to move across borders without any checks or regulations. That effect can only be exacerbated. I'll take the point of information now.
Have you considered that perhaps governments are smarter than the average Canadian public? They will be most of your arguments are primarily on large influx of migrants and instability. Governments know this will happen. They can prepare for this to happen. They can build infrastructure. I presume the thing you thought of when the 30 seconds of preparing is something governments can also think about.
I would. Touche, but I would like to attest to the fact that no amount of intelligence, no amount of foreplanning can ultimately cope with mass migration on a scale with no regulation. If you're incapable of controlling and responding in the most basic, brutal but effective way, you cannot expect a government to be able to cope that dynamically. Governments ultimately operate, at least in the Western liberal democracies, on a 4 or 5 year electoral cycle, normally. That kind of dynamism just doesn't exist. I've rattled through my points slightly faster than I expected, but I would like to point out the one final area in which we can see the underminement of the power and social security provided by states is remittancy. Migrants, we look from Nepal at the moment. Nepal's GDP has a ridiculous amount of its annual GDP is from remittances, particularly from workers who have gone to Dubai, Qatar to construct facilities there. This is the first indicator of what mass migration can do to the traditional welfare parameters of the state. The ability to tax that income and to control who it is distributed effectively to in order to better the social makeup of the state. And for these reasons, we beg you, I'll take the
so the motion is not, is this House to open borders, not this House to open all borders and also allow countries to not regulate tax and also allow countries to let terrorists in who are harmful to their country. Please engage with that. Like, countries can still regulate who comes in or like tax people or tax welfare. There's
I can see this, but fundamentally you do have to understand that the system is designed for open borders. What we're talking about here is not issues of individuals providing threats to security, it's more about the potential for theoretically unlimited scale that the motion clearly provides cannot be controlled if it's still an open border. And for these reasons, we beg you please to oppose this motion. Thank you.